Hello, time for another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is Military Strategy, A Very Short Introduction by Antulio Echeverria II. It was published in 2017 by Oxford University Press, and it's 132 pages. This is part of their Very Short Introduction series. Antulio J. Echeverria II is a professor at the U.S. Military War College, and he's written a number of books on different aspects of military strategy and tactics. In this book, Echeverria defines military strategy as reducing the enemy's capacity to fight until you achieve your goals. And there's various ways you can do this. One way, of course, is with all-out war, but there are other ways of achieving goals without necessarily fighting a big war. Some ways are using political pressure and economic pressure, and sometimes a combination of military and diplomatic and economic pressure. In this book, Echeverria sketches out various types of military strategies and kind of compares and contrasts them with each other. For example, one of the examples he gives is the difference between annihilation and dislocation. Annihilation is basically destroying the enemy's physical ability to fight, mainly by winning big battles. And of course, in the ancient world, this was the big goal. You get armies together and try to wipe each other out. But another type of strategy is dislocation, where you use surprise attacks to throw the enemy off balance and keep them dislocating their ability to respond. And the example that Echeverria gives in this book of dislocation is the Blitzkrieg attack during World War II by the Germans through Belgium, through the Ardennes Forest. Even though the French and the British armies were far stronger than Germany at the time, they were thrown off balance by this surprise attack in their most vulnerable position. Of course, the French had the Maginot Line running across France, but there was this gap in Belgium, and the German tanks rolled through there, and the French were never able to really recover from that. Another example of strategy that are compared and contrasted is attrition versus exhaustion. A war of attrition is simply when you grind down the enemy, you continue to attack them and kill off their soldiers and destroy their weapons until they're no longer able to defend themselves. This occurs when one force has greater numbers of forces and economic strength versus the enemy. And the classic example of this is the Union versus the Confederacy in the U.S. Civil War. There was never one big, overwhelming battle in the American Civil War. It was a series of battles, some of which the Confederates won. But every time they won, they lost men that they couldn't replace. They lost horses and supplies. And eventually, after 4 years of bloody fighting, the Confederacy was completely wiped out and forced to surrender. So that's the war of attrition. Exhaustion is quite opposite of that. That's when there's enough resistance that the opposing force simply gets tired of fighting and quits. And this is what happened to the British during the American Revolutionary War. The British won almost every battle, but they were never able to completely defeat the American rebels. And meanwhile, back home, the popular support for the war against the colonies declined to the point where it was they were no longer able to continue it. It was much harder to replace British soldiers than it was Americans, because they had to be shipped across the seas. And so eventually the British simply decided that continuing to fight a war against the American colonies wasn't worth it, and so they gave up, and America became an independent country. So that's exhaustion. Then he talks about the difference between deterrence versus coercion. Deterrence is when you try to discourage the enemy from doing something you don't want them to do, either by building up a huge force or putting economic pressure on them or something like that. The example given in the book of deterrence is, of course, nuclear deterrence. The fact that the Soviet Union and the United States had huge numbers of nuclear weapons aimed at each other was a mutual deterrence, and neither side was willing to use nuclear weapons for the fear that would result in a World War III that would kill everybody on Earth. And so the mere fact that you had nuclear weapons aimed at each other in roughly equal amounts was a huge deterrence not to use it. Coercion is when you use kind of a carrot and stick approach. You punish your opponents, and yet you try to reward them for doing what you want them to do. The example given in the book is the attack on the Plains Indians by the U.S. Army in the mid 19th century. The goal there was to move the Plains Indians onto reservations so that white settlers could take land and farm it and so forth. And so what they did was they offered them food supplies and land, then their own kind of autonomy. And if they refused, then they were attacked by the army and the cavalry. And this, over time, eventually succeeded. All the Native American peoples were eventually moved onto reservations. That's coercion. Then there's a chapter on terror and terrorism. He talks about how sometimes terror can be effective, but it can also be counterproductive, because usually terrorism isn't major enough to actually defeat an opponent. For example, the 9/11 attacks, did not overthrow the United States government. It didn't stop. Bin Laden's goal, one of his goals, was to disrupt the whole American economy, the whole capitalist system. Well, Wall Street shut down for, I think, 2 days after 9/11, then it was back up and running again. There were a lot of people killed, but it didn't really have a major impact on the economy. In fact, the Great Recession, which occurred a few years later, had far more of an impact on the American economy than any kind of terrorist attack would do. And the other problem, of course, is terrorism can also be counterproductive because it can turn people you're trying to win over against you. This is what happened to ISIS. They were so brutal in their areas that they in Syria and Iraq, the areas that they captured, they were so brutal to the civilians population there that they turned against them. Then there's decapitation versus targeted killing. Decapitation is kind of a graphic term, but it doesn't necessarily mean killing. It means basically destroying the command and control center, the communications network of your enemy, so that they can know that they're left leaderless and indecisive. Whereas targeted killing is more attacking rank and file people. After 9/11, the United States did a whole series of targeted killings against Al-Qaeda members. As soon as they could identify where they were, they tried to kill them, and so weaken the organization that way. And then finally, he talks about cyber power versus cyber war. He doesn't really think cyber war is an appropriate term, because very rarely does cyber attacks actually result in deaths or physical damage. Usually it's more of it does have an effect, because you can jam up computer networks and denial services and so forth. But compared to actual bombing and stuff, it's much more limited in its abilities. The final chapter discusses what makes military strategy successful and what makes military strategies fail. And he basically says there's 4 components to a successful military strategy. One is making an objective appraisal of your opponent. The reason the Germans ultimately failed in World War II is they underestimated the Allies, especially the Soviet Union. Hitler thought that the Soviet Union would collapse immediately, that the huge number of casualties would cause them to overthrow Stalin and sue for peace, when that didn't happen. And he also likewise underestimated the tenacity of the United States and the British. The constant bombing in London during the Blitz actually made the British more resistant and not less. So objective appraisal. Then deciding on a course of action, a consistent course of action. One of the problems the British had during the American Revolution is they never could come to a consistent strategy. They kept changing their mind. Sometimes they would attack up north, and then they would decide to attack in the southern colonies. They never really had a coherent strategy. The Navy and the Army did not coordinate their attacks very often, and so that was one of the reasons they failed. And then the next thing you have to do is make sure you have competent military leaders to carry out your strategy. As he points out in this book, Abraham Lincoln fired 6 generals before he finally found Ulysses S. Grant, a competent general who could actually win the war. So you have to have competent military leaders, And finally, you have to tie everything in with war plans, a consistent war plan that you stick to, but you're willing to change if necessary. So an appraisal, a course of action, competent military leaders, and war plans. So as you can tell, this is a very detailed book, although it's very short. It's very detailed, and if you're very interested in the military and military strategy, this will give you, and it's written in a very non-technical way. It'll give you a very good overview of some of the challenges of developing military strategy, especially in our modern world, where you have to take into account, as he mentions here, cyber attacks and computers and drones and various other things that weren't around in the 19th or 18th or 19th century when some of the classic books about military strategy were written. So, if you're interested in military history and military strategy, this is a good book to read, and it's very thorough. And there are extensive bibliography at the back. The book is Military Strategy: A Very Short Introduction by Antulio J. Echeverria II. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.